History remembers the victors. But what if the real story of America begins not with freedom, but with fire, gold, and oceans of blood spilled long before the United States was even imagined? In an age when desperate men sailed into the unknown, chasing glory, and instead unleashed one of the greatest human tragedies ever witnessed.
In 1492, Christopher Columbus risked everything on an impossible idea, convincing Spain's King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella that the world could be crossed westward. But the land he reached was not India. It was a continent completely unknown to Europeans and already home to thriving civilizations. When Columbus landed in the Caribbean, he encountered the Taino people, a peaceful society of farmers and fishermen who greeted the newcomers with gifts, unaware that this meeting would mark the beginning of their destruction. What began as exploration quickly turned into exploitation, as Columbus demanded gold that did not exist, forcing natives into brutal labor systems and punishing those who failed to meet impossible demands. Within a single generation, entire island populations collapsed from violence, slavery, and European diseases, turning once vibrant communities into silent, abandoned villages. Reports of Columbus's cruelty eventually reached Spain, and the man once celebrated as a visionary explorer was brought back in chains. A dramatic fall that proved even history's famous names are not always its heroes. Yet, the path Columbus opened could not be closed, and soon ambitious conquistadors began launching expeditions driven not by curiosity, but by dreams of gold, power, and empire. Among these men was Hernán Cortés, who in 1519 landed on the coast of Mexico with only hundreds of soldiers, but a plan bold enough to challenge an empire of millions. To remove any thought of retreat, Cortés ordered his ships destroyed, leaving his men with only one path forward, into the unknown heart of Mexico. Marching inland, the Spanish encountered something they never expected: the magnificent Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan, a city rising from a lake with temples, causeways, and markets larger than any city they had seen in Europe. Its ruler, Moctezuma, welcomed Cortés cautiously, unsure whether these strangers were men or figures connected to ancient prophecies, a hesitation that would prove fatal. Tension soon erupted into violence, and the Spanish found themselves trapped inside the city they had entered as guests, surrounded by thousands of warriors determined to drive them out. What followed was a brutal siege where war, hunger, and disease devastated the city, until in 1521 the great capital finally fell, ending the Aztec Empire and proving how small forces could change history through alliances and technology. The fall of the Aztecs sent shock waves across Europe and encouraged further conquests, as Spain rapidly built an empire stretching across vast parts of the Americas.
But while Spain built its empire in the south, another story was quietly beginning in the north, where English settlers would attempt something even more difficult than conquest: survival. In 1607, 3 small English ships arrived in Virginia and built a fragile settlement called Jamestown, a place where dreams of wealth quickly turned into a daily struggle against hunger, disease, and fear. Many of these settlers were not farmers or workers, but gentlemen unprepared for wilderness life. And as food ran out, their experiment in America came dangerously close to disaster. The survival of English America would soon depend on an unexpected figure, a young native girl whose story would become one of the most famous legends in American history. When winter tightened its grip on Jamestown in 1609, the colony entered what history would remember as the Starving Time, a season so desperate that strong men were reduced to shadows, and survival became more important than dignity. Food vanished quickly, and with no supplies arriving from England, the colonists began eating whatever they could find: roots, rats, leather, and, in the darkest moments, even turning to acts too disturbing for many historians to describe. Out of nearly 500 settlers, only about 60 survived that terrible winter, proving that the dream of English America almost died before it could even begin. Jamestown might have disappeared completely if not for the Powhatan Confederacy, a powerful network of native tribes who understood the land far better than the struggling newcomers. Among them was Pocahontas, the young daughter of Chief Powhatan, whose encounters with the English would later become one of the most retold stories in American history. According to English accounts, she once intervened to save Captain John Smith during a tense encounter, an event that, whether legend or truth, symbolized the fragile bridge between two very different worlds. For a time, peace and trade developed between Jamestown and the Powhatan people, allowing the colony to recover and learn the farming techniques necessary for survival. Jamestown finally found economic stability when John Rolfe successfully cultivated tobacco in 1612, transforming a failing colony into a profitable enterprise that would attract thousands more settlers. But prosperity came with consequences, as expanding plantations demanded more land and created new tensions with native tribes who saw their territories shrinking. In 1619, another event occurred that would shape American history for centuries: the arrival of the first recorded Africans brought against their will to work in the tobacco fields. What began as a small group of forced laborers would grow into a system of slavery that became deeply tied to the economic foundations of colonial America. As Jamestown grew stronger, relations with the Powhatan Confederacy deteriorated into cycles of violence, reminding both sides that survival often came at a terrible cost. While Jamestown struggled and adapted, another group of English settlers prepared for a very different journey, not for gold, but for religious freedom. In 1620, the Mayflower carried these pilgrims across the Atlantic to the cold shores of New England, where they founded Plymouth Colony in a land as unforgiving as Jamestown had once been. Like Jamestown before them, the Plymouth settlers were unprepared for the harsh winter, and by spring, Nearly half of them had died from cold and hunger. Their survival was made possible by the Wampanoag people, who taught them how to grow corn, catch fish, and navigate the unfamiliar land.
To celebrate their first successful harvest, the settlers shared a meal with their native allies, an event later remembered as the First Thanksgiving, though its deeper story is far more complex. Peace, however, did not last forever, as growing English populations continued expanding into native lands, setting the stage for future conflicts that would reshape the region.
These early colonies had survived hunger, disease, and isolation, but their greatest challenges were still ahead, as competition for land would soon ignite some of the bloodiest wars of early American history. By the mid-17th century, the fragile peace between English settlers and Native American tribes began to collapse, as expanding colonies demanded more land, more resources, and more control over territories that had belonged to native nations for generations. One of the first major explosions of violence came in 1636 during the Pequot War, when conflict between settlers and the Pequot tribe turned into a brutal struggle that would permanently change the balance of power in New England. The war reached its horrifying climax when colonial forces surrounded a Pequot fortified village and set it on fire, killing hundreds and sending a clear message about the deadly future of colonial expansion. As decades passed, the English colonies continued growing, forming what would eventually become the 13 colonies stretched along the Atlantic coast. Each colony developed its own economy and culture, but all remained tied to Britain, sending raw materials across the ocean while relying on British protection and trade. Metacom, the son of Massasoit, watched as English settlements spread across his people's lands and eventually chose war in 1675, hoping to stop the destruction of native independence. The war that followed was brutal on both sides. Entire towns were burned, families displaced, and the frontier became a landscape of fear. By 1676, the war ended, with Metacom killed and native resistance in New England permanently weakened, clearing the path for further colonial expansion. As the colonies expanded, their connection with Britain also deepened, drawing them into global conflicts such as the 7 Years' War, which would reshape the future of North America. Fought between Britain and France from 1756 to 1763, this global conflict ended with Britain controlling vast new territories, but also drowning in massive war debt. To recover financially, Britain began taxing its American colonies, believing it was only fair that the colonies help pay for their own defense. But many colonists disagreed, arguing that taxes without representation violated their rights as English citizens, planting dangerous ideas of resistance. Protests began growing across the colonies as merchants boycotted British goods and ordinary citizens began questioning imperial authority. What Britain saw as simple taxation, the colonists began to see as tyranny, and the relationship between colony and empire slowly began to fracture. By the late 18th century, 13 separate colonies were beginning to think of themselves not just as British subjects, but as something new, something American. The struggles of Jamestown, the survival of Plymouth, the conflicts with native nations, and the pressure of empire had all unknowingly prepared these colonies for revolution.
Soon, events would unfold that would transform resistance into rebellion, and rebellion into revolution, giving birth to a nation that would one day become the United States of America. But that is a story for the next expedition, where we will witness how protest turned into war and how ordinary colonists became revolutionaries. The road to American independence was not built in a single moment, but through generations of survival, conflict, ambition, and sacrifice. From Columbus crossing unknown oceans to settlers fighting to survive, and colonies learning to resist an empire, the story of America is ultimately a story of human determination. Thank you for joining Mind Expedition on this journey into the forgotten origins of America, where history is not just remembered, but experienced. If you want to continue exploring the moments that shaped our world, make sure to subscribe to Mind Expedition and join our next expedition.